Here's the core question I think most people are missing. DeFi, I actually believe it can work. Let me be clear, I believe in DeFi, but what many tech-driven builders are creating today is missing something crucial. And that crucial thing is this. What's the real demand for this system? What external utility does it serve? I'm not talking about yield farming within a closed circle. Not speculators trying to flip coins out of curiosity. Nassim Taleb raised this issue and he had a point. Does this system offer anything of value outside itself? That's how the real world works. If an industry receives support from the outside world, it should return something valuable to that world. If the system only circulates within itself, let me give you an example. My child used to study violin. Watching that made me reflect. We paid lesson fees to violin teachers, and then when students become violinists, they give lessons too. They live off those lessons. That's a kind of closed-loop ecosystem, a self-contained system. But that means it doesn't give anything back to the outside world. Let me put it simply. Unless we have a booming music market where people buy violin albums, attend live concerts, unless there's real audience demand, there's no true reason for the violin industry to exist. That's how the world works. But when I looked closer, I realized the inner circle had become larger than the outer one. So many kids learn violin when they're young, and those teachers were once paying students themselves. A few of them stay in the system, become teachers, teach kids, prepare them for college auditions, and those kids play harder to compete. And their families spend 20 bitcoins along the way, and that's how they get into college. And some eventually become violin teachers themselves. So what's the actual foundation of this system? It's essentially a pyramid structure. Kids who study violin for just a month, or maybe a year, or like my daughter, who plays for 3 years just for a college audition and quits. These are the people bringing money into the system from the outside. They're the ones keeping the ecosystem alive. Now in Korea's case, the system rarely produces world-class violinists who move people with their music, touching audiences, creating a market. That part of the market is small and unstable. If the ecosystem relies less on internal recycling and more on a broader external base, then it becomes far more sustainable and healthy. You see what I mean? If it gives a lot to the outside world, then it's natural for value to come back in from the outside. But Nassim Taleb asks, what exactly are you giving to the world? He starts with Bitcoin, but he's really criticizing blockchain as a whole. What does any of this give back to society? Now, it's not about how clever your DeFi algorithms are. The real question is, what value do you deliver beyond your own circle? Where's the real world demand? If you don't ask that, you're making the same mistake people made when they ignored Bitcoin's role as money and just ran after the tech. There has to be real demand. So what is that real demand? It's supply chain finance. You need a deeper understanding of how supply chains are financed. So on this channel, unless you all stop me, I'll keep walking you through Bitcoin as a monetary phenomenon, connecting it to other ideas along the way. That's the path I'll keep going down, and I know that's what many of you want from me. You ask, why does it have to be Bitcoin crossing borders under the absorbing barrier? Can Ethereum do that too? If the absorbing barrier hits 5 years from now, Ethereum could absolutely be the right answer. Even in 30 years, Ethereum might still make sense. But if we're talking 70 years from now, I'm not so sure. Honestly, that's the question I'm trying to answer. Because if Ethereum outpaced Bitcoin purely on technical grounds, then by the same logic, Ethereum could one day be obsolete too, right? If it's all just about technology, I mean. That's why I keep saying there's something more to this than just technology, especially when it comes to money. And that something more is absolutely critical. Now, do you see where I'm coming from? If you read Taleb's writings, Taleb is a crisis management expert. He's deeply grounded in probability theory. And since I've studied stats and probability myself, let me break it down simply. Taleb sees complex systems like these as series circuits. He treats the technology like a string of dependent components. Imagine building a Christmas tree with strings of lights blinking everywhere. Let's say there are 3 strings of bulbs, red, blue, and green. They flash on and off. Now, sometimes the red lights or blue lights are wired in a series circuit. If just one bulb in that line fails, the whole red strand goes out. None of them light up. Now imagine trying to fix that when it's a massive tree, like one big enough to cover an entire cathedral. There might be 300 red bulbs in that string. You'd have to test every single one of them, because even one failed filament breaks the entire circuit, and that ruins your entire Christmas tree. Now here's where probability comes in. It's 1 minus p. P being the success rate of each component. Let's say each bulb has a 99.9999% chance of working. You raise that to the power of infinity. 0.99999 to the power of infinity. Actually, you don't even need infinity to feel the effect. 0.99999 is really close to 1, almost perfect. But if you raise that number to the power of 10,000 and subtract it from 1, you're basically left with 1, because the probability converges towards 0. So what does that mean? If you need something to succeed every single time for the system to work, even with extremely high success rates, then even one failure could collapse the entire system. That's what Taleb is saying, because the system is wired in series. Taleb views Bitcoin's architecture like a series circuit. Failure in one point brings down the whole. So he believes the absorbing barrier is inevitable. Not just because of price ceilings, but because technology will eventually make it obsolete. It will be replaced by newer tech, he argues. And so the logic is, if better tech emerges, wouldn't Bitcoin inevitably be left behind forever? Just because something worked until now, does that guarantee it lasts forever? His math, 0.99999 to the power of infinity, eventually becomes 0. So 1 minus 0 equals 1. Collapse is a certainty. That's the argument. And that's why you can't evaluate Bitcoin solely as technology. You might not believe me now, but hear me out. Money is a ledger. There's an island where cigarettes were used as money. Even when people stopped smoking, did they stop using cigarettes as currency? No, they still used them as money. Why? Because those cigarettes functioned as ledgers. In other words, here's what Taleb overlooks. Yes, the chance of system failure in individual events might be 0.99999, not 1. But over time, that risk becomes irrelevant because Bitcoin is a ledger, because it functions as money, not just code. So even if a technical collapse occurs, it doesn't necessarily destroy the people who hold Bitcoin. I know, it sounds crazy, right? Sure, if it happened today, it would be a disaster. But if it happens 100 years from now, the system doesn't collapse. Because by then, Bitcoin will be more than just technology. It will be a social institution. To explain this, I bring in the humanities, when the fact that money at its core is a ledger. I know that might sound hard to believe right now, but that's the exact trap Taleb fell into. He's like, all right, I get it. It's money, a decentralized ledger, fine. Then he shifts the entire conversation back to technology, just like regulators do, just like banks do. That's why Bitcoin keeps coming back. Every time they say it's dead, it rises again. Bitcoiners have been through this, mocked, doubted, dismissed. But Ethereum folks haven't experienced that because they've always operated in a friendlier intellectual environment. That context is important to understand. People say Bitcoin maximalists are hard to talk to, but Ethereum has been embraced by the world from the start. It's a cool tech, let's see what it can do. Okay, maybe that's a bit much. It sounds like a lot of hype, but because Bitcoin just clicks, because it's a perfect match with reality, they attack Bitcoin. And sometimes Ethereum gets caught in the crossfire. But Ethereum has never been seriously ridiculed or attacked by academics or cultural elites like Bitcoin has. So when things get hostile, there's no resilience, no muscle memory, because Ethereum never fully engaged with the real issue, money malfunding. So Ethereum might find itself in the same vulnerable spot someday. EOS and other chains will come along, and they'll say, hey, you're slower than us. You're yesterday's news, and they'll try to replace you. So what will you argue then? You'll have no choice but to borrow the logic developed by Bitcoiners like me, whether you like it or not. And that logic, that comes from the humanities. I don't just study Bitcoin. I study finance, especially DeFi and supply chains. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how supply chain finance might integrate with all of this. And I've made progress, at least in my head. When that absorbing barrier comes, Bitcoin may not be the only answer, but there won't be many alternatives. But my point wasn't that Bitcoin will be the only survivor beyond the absorbing barrier. I was arguing against the idea that it would inevitably fail. I'm not saying Bitcoin is the only cross-border solution, but aside from Bitcoin, there will be other alternatives, but I'm fairly certain Bitcoin will be one of them. I'm confident about Bitcoin. I'm just not sure what else will stand beside it. There will be others, but I can't yet say what they are. And I'll tell you why I can't know that yet. Because in platform technology, the competition is brutal. Ethereum is doing a fantastic job right now. But even if it dominates, there's no guarantee Google or someone else won't take it away. Why? Because this isn't a business-to-consumer game. It's business-to-business. And in business-to-business, giants can take over fast. So really, dig into supply chain finance. That's where things are heading. If you're in the Ethereum camp and don't want to hear me out, then at least study supply chain finance for yourself. And think hard about how that connects to DeFi. Because without supply chain finance, DeFi starts to look like a bit of a joke. Seriously. It's just people printing yield among themselves. A closed loop, like I mentioned earlier with the violin ecosystem. And the only outside users are the kids who try violin for a bit, whose parents keep pouring money into it, but it's not really creating any cultural output. Well, nothing that amazes the world or adds value outside the circle. I'm not saying that's all it is. So violin teachers, please don't flood my comments. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor, okay? I'm just showing where this can go. And yes, DeFi could end up that way. Looking at where it's headed, you can't ignore the essential monetary and financial dimension. And when I say monetary and financial phenomena, when people say we do study finance, well, sure, but the core of monetary finance is the ledger, the thing Taleb missed. Even if nobody smoked cigarettes, still functioned as money on that island. So even if Bitcoin's tech has a 0.99999 chance of functioning properly, and over time that converges to zero, his conclusion, collapse is inevitable, only holds if you view this as just tech. But people don't collapse because of failed tech. They survive because of their obsession with ledgers. It's belief in the ledger. That's what holds the system together.